Another strong round of severe weather is coming to the Midwest and northern plains, and it's going to bring the risk for a strong tornado or two, plus hurricane force winds and the potential for large to very large hail. After that, we're going to be getting into a ridging pattern, which could bring temperatures upwards of 105 degrees Fahrenheit to populated areas like New York City. As that ridge develops, our severe weather threat is going to shift to more of a mesoscale setup day by day, where there's going to be a lot of uncertainty and the regions for severe weather are going to be smaller, and you're going to have less lead time. So it's important that you're staying weather aware. I'm going to break down everything that you need to know so that you can stay weather aware and so that you can stay safe regarding the severe weather tonight in the Midwest and the northern plains and the upcoming significant heat wave coming to the eastern half of the United States. So let's get right into the forecast. Hopping right into our day one categorical outlook, this is for Monday, as we do have a large marginal 1 out of 5 risk, and inside that you're going to have a 2 out of 5 slight risk that's also very large, and a smaller 3 out of 5 enhanced risk that you're seeing there in orange. And then down in Texas and the Oklahoma Panhandle, we do have a marginal 1 out of 5 risk. That's going to be for a little bit of an isolated wind threat. Looking at our tornado probabilistic outlook, we do have a large 2% risk for tornadoes that's going to stretch all the way from Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, into the Dakotas, and clipping the westernmost portions of Wisconsin. We also have a 5% area that you're seeing in brown with that hatched SIG 1 region as well. That's where we're expecting a more elevated threat for tornadoes right along the Minnesota and North Dakota border, with the potential for an isolated strong tornado or two. Wind is going to be one of our greatest threats tonight. Again, down in Texas and the Oklahoma Panhandle, we do have an isolated risk. It's only a 5% risk for some isolated wind damage down there, but we do have a much larger region for wind damage all the way from Kansas up through Wisconsin, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, into the Dakotas, and of course all of Minnesota. And within that, we're going to have a large SIG 1 risk that you're seeing there hatched. And then we also have a SIG 2 region, which is within a 30% risk region as well for wind damage. So a lot of layers here, but essentially what's going on is near the Dakotas and Minnesota, we are expecting an elevated risk for strong wind damage, including the risk for some hurricane force winds going on across the Dakotas and northwestern Minnesota when things become a little bit more linear and the low-level jet gets introduced a little later in the evening. Our hail outlook for the day does include a very large 5% area as well, but also a pretty large 15% risk with, especially in the Dakotas and northwestern Minnesota, a SIG 1 region where we could see that large to very large hail out there. But again, these are going to be a little bit more isolated instances as storm mode is expected to get linear pretty quickly, and at which point the wind threat will increase and the hail threat will decrease, and as well as the tornado threat will decrease a little bit. But the initial supercells, especially out in the Dakotas, are most likely to produce some of that very large hail that we could see this evening. As we look ahead into Tuesday, there is going to be a slight 2 out of 5 risk for severe weather. There is a 1 out of 5 marginal risk up in the Northeast, where we could see a little bit of an isolated tornado potential with some isolated storms up there, but it's a little more uncertain. Same thing goes for all the way back through Colorado from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, all the way through Nebraska, Iowa, southern Minnesota, and then in Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where there's a little bit more concern associated with the fact that there's going to be plenty of shear and not a ton of interruption caused by Monday's convection from tonight. Our tornado probabilities are going to be a little bit lower as a result. We do have a 2% region up in the Northeast where there's a little bit of uncertainty, but some isolated supercell structure could develop into the afternoon and evening tomorrow night. And then also back into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and northern half of Wisconsin. That is definitely the area of greater concern for me, though it is a smaller area, as there will be a little bit more of a favorable shear profile present in the atmosphere. Most of these storms are probably going to be mostly outflow dominant though, and that's why wind is our primary threat here. We have a 5% up in the Northeast, a large 5% all the way back almost to Denver, and then up through Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And again, that 15% in the northern half of Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula. So that is where our greatest concern is going to be for those wind damages, as these storms will likely be mostly outflow dominant, but a couple of them, again, could pose that threat for a little bit of hail and a potential tornado. Back towards the Rockies, we do have a SIG 1 area outlined for hail, believe it or not, but this is only a 5% risk. And this is just going to be associated with any of these storms that actually can bring in some good inflow and get some strong updrafts going. But there is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of concern regarding the lack of low-level support with some of these storms in terms of heat and moisture at the surface for them to get some good updrafts going. So the hail threat is definitely a lower percent probability, but if a storm can get going, it could definitely produce some of that large to very large hail. And then we also have another 5% region up in the Northeast, and then extending all the way up through Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula as well. As we start to look forward out towards Wednesday and even into the future, we are going to have that large ridge that's going to be building over the eastern half of the United States, bringing that possible heat wave. And along the northern part of that ridge, we could have a couple of ridge riding convective systems. And all of these are going to be more of these mesoscale type of days. So we're not going to have these widespread, significant severe weather risks for large portions of the country, but we will have a couple of areas where we could have some isolated storms firing up. On Wednesday, that's going to include the Northeast as well as all the way back down through the Central Plains and up to the Upper Peninsulas yet again. The Storm Prediction Center only has a 5% region outlined for this area as a result. But again, there is a very slim but non-zero potential for some tornadoes on Wednesday. But I will say the primary concern is probably going to be winds. And even in any scenario, we're not expecting this to be a large-scale severe weather outbreak by any stretch. This would be much more small-scale stuff. A couple of isolated strong storms is kind of what we would be looking at. Maybe one or two line segments of bowing structures where we could get some of those strong outflow winds associated with them. I did want to talk about what's going on right now with this morning's convection, as we do have a destructive severe thunderstorm warning in South Dakota headed towards areas like Aberdeen. This one is bringing the risk for 100+ mile-per-hour winds. So a very, very strong severe thunderstorm with some very, very strong winds blowing through South Dakota. And part of the reason I wanted to talk about this was because how far this storm makes it to the north and northeast could impact our severe weather up in Minnesota and Wisconsin and the Dakotas later this afternoon and evening, as this storm is quite powerful and could definitely set up a nice outflow boundary out in that region, which could enhance some localized vorticity. So we're going to monitor it very closely to see just how far to the north and northeast it can make it throughout the day and early afternoon. Looking at the timing for today's severe weather, we are expecting this cluster of thunderstorms to make its way all the way up through the northwestern corner of Minnesota. So as we go forward in time, we are going to watch that happen. And that's the one currently ongoing right now that's producing some of those significant damaging winds out in South Dakota anyway. As we go a little bit forward in time, we are going to see more convection firing off in the northwestern Minnesota region. And again, any of these storms that can remain discrete will pose the risk for being supercellular by nature and having some of that tornado or hail risk. Back in North Dakota, kind of a similar story along the cold front. Some of those cells just starting to fire off by around 4 p.m. And as we go forward in time, some of these initial cells are going to start pushing off into the Canadian prairies as the cold front continues to make its way out towards Minnesota. And around the time it crosses the border into Minnesota at around 8 p.m., we're going to be seeing all this convection starting to fire off here along that warm front. And again, any storms that can remain discrete and supercellular will pose a little bit of a tornado risk, especially in northwestern Minnesota. And then as we go forward into 9, 10, and 11 p.m., these things become a line of thunderstorms that push off towards Wisconsin and eventually the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And once things become a lot more linear, the threat is definitely going to shift to more of a wind threat than anything else, with the possibility for an embedded tornado or two, but mostly just a straight line wind damage threat associated with these as they move off into that area. As things make their way overnight, we are going to see some of those storms ride along the Great Lakes, along that ridge, and just start to plummet back down towards New York by the early afternoon. By around 5 p.m. here, we're seeing some of those storms rolling through New York. And again, any of those could pose a little bit of a risk for supercellular development, though I am expecting it to be more of a cluster of thunderstorms, which would significantly reduce our overall severe weather hazards besides our strong winds. But back towards Michigan and Wisconsin, what you're going to notice is that you're going to get a lot of explosive thunderstorm development in the early evening hours on Tuesday. And as we roll through in time, those are going to continue to push through the Upper Peninsula and generally through the Great Lakes region as a whole. And those storms are going to pose possibly a larger risk for maybe a little bit of tornado development, but definitely a risk for some large hail and some strong winds. Also at the surface is an absolute abundance of moisture, and you can just see it surging up into the northern Midwest, up into Minnesota. And you can actually watch that line of storms come through associated with your dew points. You can just watch them eating up that moisture right about here as they start to push through Minnesota and stretching all the way down as far as Iowa. Looking at our surface features, we are going to have a low pressure system coming out of Nebraska and making its way up into the Dakotas and near Minnesota, and that's what's going to be driving our severe weather for this evening. While cloud cover might seem like one of the more simple things that we can talk about, it's actually really important for our severe weather, especially today, as we're going to basically watch that warm front continue to propagate to the north. And south of it, you're going to have a little bit better heating, but in the northwestern Minnesota Minnesota area, where our better shear environment is going to be, we're not going to have as much cloud cover breaking up, and therefore we're not going to get as much sunlight and as much instability going on in that region. So that's going to be one of the limiting factors for severe weather tonight, and especially tornadoes. And that is definitely why our probabilities are not quite so high, especially in that region. Looking at our atmosphere in terms of our shear, by the time we get to the afternoon and evening, this is why there is definitely a concern for a strong tornado or two, is we're going to have some pretty favorable shearing going on, especially in northwestern Minnesota, where areas like Grand Forks are definitely going to be in that high shear environment, more conducive for tornadoes. One thing that is important to look at, though, is look at the direction of our storm motion vectors, okay? All of these are pointing up towards the northeast, so keep that in mind. I'm going to show you another map here. Okay, it's a little bit difficult to see, but you can still see that green arrow indicating our storm motion. And now what I just highlighted there is going to be your cold front, where on the left side or the western half, you're going to see that cooler air. On the eastern half or the right side, you're going to see that warmer air. And what you'll notice is that this motion vector for our storms is a lot more parallel to our forcing mechanism than you would want. So that is going to signify that we'll probably have a lot of upscale growth. So essentially, storms that fire off in a situation like this will quickly smash into each other as they're kind of moving right up towards each other along a line. So things will likely become a line of thunderstorms decently quickly, especially by around 9 p.m. this evening. So the overall tornado threat is going to be limited by the fact that we're not going to have a very long, discrete supercell mode. So a lot of our convection is going to be in a line of thunderstorms this evening. So that will limit our tornado threat and increase our wind threat as things go into the later evening hours. But I will say, as you get into areas like the northernmost corners of Minnesota, that is not exactly the case. So you could still see some of that tornadic development, especially a little earlier in the evening up in that area. And I did just want to briefly show the type of upper level support that we do have in place. By around 8 p.m. and even 9 p.m. here, you can see we're getting some pretty strong winds at 500 millibars, which is indicative of divergence, and that is indicative as a result of rising motion and just upper level support in general. So throughout this whole area, we're definitely having plenty of upper level support associated with this system. And while the significant tornado parameter does have a lot of limitations, I did want to use it in this case really just to highlight where this warm front's going to set up. So around 4 p.m., you'll see any storms that can fire off anywhere near Fargo are going to kind of ride along that warm front to the east. And those are going to pose the greatest risk for that tornado threat. And we'll see a little bit further in time as we get a little more linear, that increase in the significant tornado parameter in the warm sector associated with any storms that can fire off ahead of the line and remain discrete. And you also see that line of storms beginning to form there on the significant tornado parameter, where some embedded tornadoes are definitely possible. But the tornado threat is going to last even into the later evening hours around 11 p.m. tonight. And finally, you'll remember we talked about this ridge that's going to be setting up in the last forecast, as well as a little bit earlier in this one. And this is as we're rolling through time into July here. This ridge is still going to be in place, bringing higher pressure and tons of heat to the eastern half of the United States, especially up on the East Coast and towards the Northeast, areas that don't necessarily get that much heat all the time. We will see it start to break up as we get into the second week of July here, which will provide a little bit of relief. And to cap things off today, we are going to be looking at the temperatures that we're going to be seeing peaking up really, really, really hot over the next week or two across the entire United States. You're going to see in the entire eastern half of the nation and even back into the Northeast, these values getting above 100 at times. In New York City, getting to 106 on some days. Areas like Charlotte up in the hundreds as well. Things are just going to be very, very, very hot as we roll through time through the second week of July even. And even once that high pressure breaks up, we're still going to be seeing a lot of very hot temperatures and even back into the western half of the United States eventually here into the second week of July as that low pressure system, as that ridge starts to break up and we see some of those warmer airs surge back into the desert Southwest and up into the Northwest. And that heat wave is going to take us to the end of today's forecast. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will be going live tonight, Monday night, with a possible broadcast Tuesday night as well, maybe even Wednesday night. It just depends how things shape up. So definitely make sure that you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so that you know when we go live and you don't miss anything, so that you can stay weather aware and stay safe as we go through the next couple of days and into this giant heat wave coming to the entire eastern half of the United States. So stay safe out there, stay cool, keep some water on you, and we'll see you soon.